Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're having a sit-down, a dinner party at the Palace of Versailles between the leaders of France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. They're talking about how to kickstart Europe, if you will, amid pressures from the East with Vladimir Putin, from the West with a Donald Trump who's, as our panel was saying, less interested in Europe, and also the upcoming start of Brexit negotiations in earnest. With us to talk about it from Berlin, Jörg Förbrig of the German Marshall Fund. From Brussels, Peter Kleppe, fellow at the Open Europe think tank, John Paolo Accardo, editor of Vox Europe, and from Warsaw, Marcin Zaborowski, senior associate at Visegrad Insight. Welcome back to all of you. We were talking just before the break how the United States wary of more carrying the can, if you will, when it comes to NATO. Last month, the U.S. initiating its biggest deployment to Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War. Tanks positioned first to Poland, then to Estonia. The incoming administration warning that there are strings attached to NATO membership. In a word, as the new defense secretary said last month in Munich, pay your dues.
To confront the threats facing our alliance, we must recognize not just strategic realities, but also political realities. President Trump came into office and has thrown now his full support to NATO. He, too, espouses NATO's need to adapt to today's strategic situation for it to remain credible, capable, and relevant. Further, as Minister von der Leyen noted last week, it is a fair demand that all who benefit from the best alliance in the world carry their proportionate share of the necessary costs to defend our freedoms. And we are committed to passing those freedoms intact to the next generation.
Paying your proportionate share. Jörg Förbrig, right now, Germany's military budget is 1.2% of GDP, below the 2% threshold for NATO members. France is also below that 2%. He mentioned in his words, Jim Mattis, the German defense minister, when she talks about increasing defense spending, it's already campaign season where you are. Her rivals see it as unbridled spending.
No. In the first place, I think we have to acknowledge that for a number of years now, defense spending in Germany has been rising. This is already a story of at least 2-3 years, and it's one that will continue. Now, the increases that we have seen are modest. They will not, in the foreseeable future, take Germany to the 2% mark that NATO members have committed themselves to. But nonetheless, there is a dynamic and a new trend already that takes security more seriously, and that also shows an increased willingness to invest in security again.
But the public opinion's divided. Some are saying they don't want to spend the money.
Well, in the first place, certainly for our political class to convince people that this spending is necessary.
Because we're hearing, for instance, in the government right now, the foreign minister, who's also the head of the outgoing head of the SPD, Sigmar Gabriel, he's not singing from the same hymn sheet as the defense minister.
Well, no, they also come from different parties. And as you mentioned, it is campaign season. So these parties, even though they share a government at the moment, are obviously trying to distinguish themselves from one another and play different tunes towards the voters. This is natural. This probably is the same in other countries that hold elections this year.
Marcin Zaborowski, your thoughts on what Germany's position should be inside of NATO and inside of Europe when it comes to defense?
Well, I think it's quite clear that Germany has the potential for leadership on defense and security and political affairs in Europe. The German leaders have stated it for a number of years right now, that they are prepared to face up to the responsibility that is staring in their face. And I think that it's inevitable that defense spending and Germany's investment in security will be rising. If I'm not mistaken, the German government is committed to have 2% GDP on defense by 2024, and this is not changing. However, there is a little bit of a problem with Donald Trump, putting it as a condition for US engagement in Europe. And I think it's not helpful for German politicians to increase defense spending because, this strange man with blonde hair is telling them to do that.
So what are you suggesting that how Germany handles Donald Trump?
I think it's counterproductive for the US to sort of put out conditions like that, saying, Matt is coming out in Munich and saying, you guys, if you don't invest defense spending, we will, rethink our investment in your security. This is not a government. The US administration is unpopular in Europe. Donald Trump is extremely unpopular in Europe. And him putting forward conditions like that is actually giving ammunition in the hands of people who are skeptical about raising defense spending. So I think it's counterproductive. I think Europe needs to become more serious about its own defense needs, but not because Donald Trump tells them to be like that.
Peter Kleppe, you agree?
Well, I think I disagree with the premise that to have better defense, you need to spend more. I mean, massive amounts are going on in that area. If you only look at the new airplanes that some countries are planning to buy from the United States, I think the F-35, many experts agree that this is not necessarily the best investment. One good thing about Trump is perhaps that he causes a wake-up call. Some European countries have really, for a very long time, relied too heavily on the United States for their own defense. And in that sense, it's only healthy that they take this more serious.
Healthy that they take it more seriously? And how should Europe handle Donald Trump's call, or some may perceive it as a threat to fellow NATO members? How should Europe respond?
Well, I think European countries, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, of course, they can coordinate what they can do together. There's nothing wrong with that, within the NATO framework, ideally, of course. But I don't think necessarily spending more is a good idea. If you look at the history of defense spending, it's fraught with waste and misinvestment. So I really think it's way too simplistic to overly focus on this 2% NATO purpose.
I don't over-focus on spending necessarily, but let me ask Jörg Vorbrig, how real is the threat, particularly from Russia?
Well, I think it is real. I think we need to listen to the neighbors that we have in the east, the Baltic states, Poland. They, in the first place, are exposed to Russia. They have their own experience with the country also historically. And for all too long, I think we in Central and Western Europe have basically dismissed these concerns. Already 10 years ago, Eastern Europeans, Central Europeans have been telling us that there is a problem rising in the East with Russia going more aggressive. And we have dismissed that easily as some form of paranoia or Russophobia. I think in the last years, especially with Russia's war in Ukraine, but also with all kinds of posturing and provocations in the Baltic Sea, around borders, around NATO ships, planes, civilian and military, we should have seen that Russia is serious, and that these concerns that our eastern neighbors have voiced for a very long time are substantiated. So, in that sense, I think we obviously need to close ranks with our partners, members of the same organizations, whether EU or NATO, as ourselves, help them strengthen their defense, help them be reassured that they can count on the solidarity across these two powerful blocs as full members. and perhaps also compensate to some extent for the fears that are now induced from the Washington end. So with the statements of President Trump that security is conditional on defense spending by NATO members, I think we in Europe, Germany in particular, but others as well, need to be even more forthcoming when it comes to our neighbors to the east that are exposed to that pressure emanating from Russia in particular.
All right, it may not be a Cold War yet again, but Sweden, for its part, taking no chances. The center-left government there announcing last week that it's reintroducing the draft, a draft it had scrapped in 2011. From henceforth, all able-bodied men and now even women will have to serve in the military.
It won't feel so great if you have to spend so much time doing something you really don't want to do or something you're against. Personally, I don't support general warfare and fighting.
I think it's great. I simply think it's a good thing that so many young people will be able to get some experience of what defense is about.
Gianpaolo Accardo, what's your reaction when you saw that story?
Well, there's not much to be surprised because it's been years since Russian planes are entering towards inside Swedes' airspace, just trying to provoke to probe let's say the nerves of Swedish defense. And yet it seems that they've managed to get some success in that. But some European countries are also talking about reintroducing the draft, but more for social reasons, to encourage social mixity. As once upon a time, the draft was a way to mix up mid-class and working class youngsters. But in Northern and Eastern Europe, there's maybe to some extent, some excessive fear of Russian military interfering, probably because if Russia has to act militarily in Europe, it will not act with huge gear like planes or tanks. It's more on the intelligence or even on the internet. And this is probably where Europeans should focus instead of building up more defense capacity in the classical way. It's more on the intelligence and on fighting over the internet to let's say, to avoid Russia to meddle in, for example, into elections, either with through the internet or also through propaganda. This is really the place where the new Cold War, if there is one, will be taking place.
All right, so you agree with Peter Kleppe? You don't need
on the ground.
You agree with Peter Kleppe then that you don't need to buy an aircraft carrier to update your defense. But let me ask you, on that score, Gianpaolo Accardo, big problem in the past with intelligence services is they're not great at sharing information. We've had the creation of, for instance, of Europol, yet different services that are allied are still wary of one another. This idea of it's going to be won over the internet or with intelligence, how far can you take it in Europe today?
Well, it should be easier than getting together with the classical military appliances, the classical military gear. And we have seen with the attacks on Paris and on Brussels that not sharing intelligence could cause a lot of critical damage to the European population. So at least the European countries will be kind of obliged to cooperate on the intelligence point of view because it's in their own interest and it's quite easier and it costs much less and it's more effective than the classical military appliances.
Marcin Zaborowski, you agree?
Well, not quite. I mean, I think that as Jörg was arguing before, I think the threat from Russia is very real. It's quite imminent. It does happen on a daily basis in Ukraine. It's actually next door from Poland, so it's very, very close. All the studies of a possible Russian invasion on the Baltic states are showing that at the moment Baltic states are indefensible. It could take Russia up to 12 hours to basically create a fait accompli and, you know, get almost to Warsaw if it wanted to. It can launch, you know, missiles which are capable of hitting, you know, Berlin, Warsaw, Prague within a space of a few minutes. So we really, at the moment, we don't have capabilities to deter that. I mean, we already done a lot by the last decisions of the NATO summit, which resulted in the placement of NATO troops in Poland and the Baltic states. Now, if the Russians come and invade, they would know that also some NATO allies could die in that process, which is bringing the whole alliance into the gameplay. So this is already a big difference, but we don't have capabilities to deter against possible Russian aggression. And the Russian intentions are clearly very belligerent.
Peter Klippa, there you hear Marcin saying that the threat is real of Russian tanks marching on EU members. Your reaction?
Well, I do think we should take these concerns serious because it's been proven in Ukraine that I mean, Russia has basically implemented a stealth land invasion of parts of Ukraine. So this is not some kind of a fairy tale. But on the other hand, I do think NATO member states perfectly still have the capacity to deter Russia as they had during the Cold War. I don't think we're back in a real Cold War yet, but there clearly is the danger. So I do agree that you need military capability apart from, of course, all the security capability to deter that. However, on top of that, I also think that you need to keep Russia in the international system. And that's why I think the sanctions against Russia, I'm not so sure they have done much. I mean, the war in Ukraine is still going on. Russia hasn't backed off. Maybe they would have gone further without the sanctions. We'll never know. But these sanctions, if you look at all kinds of other conflicts, have typically never really done much to improve the situation. I think over the long term, the best strategy is to keep enemies inside in the international trade system and make them more dependent of international trade. And from the moment you start isolating countries, I think that's where it really gets very dangerous.
Jörg Farbrig, you agree?
Well, I don't think trade is your guarantee for security. I think we've seen for over 25 years through closer and closer trade that we had a developing relationship with Russia. We actually privileged Russia in many ways over the other eastern neighbors that the EU has. To give you a very simple example, we held EU-Russia summits twice a year. We are holding EU Eastern Partnership summits. So with countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, we are holding them once in 2 years. So clearly there is a hope that we had that through moving closer with Russia, developing trade, energy ties, including Russia in also Western organizations. Mind you, we have a special NATO-Russia Council that was to address difficult questions. Nonetheless, despite this very forthcoming treatment that we extended to Russia, to include them as much as possible in international structures and trade schemes, we were not spared a Russian war in Eastern Europe. I think there are limits to what soft power inclusion cooperation can achieve. And unfortunately, it is the Ukrainians that had to learn that lesson again in the last years. So I don't think we can rely on that. Nobody says that we should exclude Russia from any international system cooperation. On the contrary, I think the steps that the European Union, also NATO, the international community broadly have taken in response to the aggression in Ukraine were relatively timid. They weren't particularly damaging to Russia. We haven't cut any energy ties, knowing full well that this is the main source of revenues of the Kremlin. So I think we have been relatively soft, actually, in our response because we didn't want to make matters worse. Nonetheless, they have gotten worse, and I do think that we need to prepare, perhaps, for even more aggression, whether in the classical military sense or whether in the hybrid sense of Russian interference through social media, through political parties, in electoral processes, in the internal decision-making of our countries, as we also had to learn, especially, for instance, in the case of the US presidential elections.
Yeah, what worries you more, Jörg Farbrig? Is it the aggressive posturing out of Moscow or the uncertainty with a new administration in Washington that's hard to read?
Well, I think the Russian factor is the more problematic, most certainly. I think what we see in Washington at the moment is that campaign rhetoric hits reality. Many of the things that Donald Trump said as a candidate already had to be moderated now that he's a president. So NATO now is by no means as obsolete by the looks of things in the eyes of the new US administration as it sounded during the electoral campaign. So it seems to me that with a lot of upheaval, with a lot of uncertainty, certainly on the Washington side, this new administration still does seem to be sort of settling into an institutional framework, both inside of the country and outside, that we can rely upon. In the case of Russia, this is not the case. It is Russian policy to break rules. It is exactly the opposite of what we've been hoping we would achieve through cooperation, through frameworks, joint organizations. So for that reason, I think the much more problematic and uncertain factor is certainly in the East and not in the West.
Marcin Zaborowski, you agree that already there are signs that Trump is calming down, if you will, when it comes to actual policy?
Yes, I mean, broadly, I agree with Jörg. I'm a little bit less optimistic on that. I mean, I think that it's indeed we've seen signs of moderation. For example, a clearly pro-Russian National Security Advisor General Flynn was replaced with a very realistic, rather hawkish General McMaster, who has very realistic views of Russia. We have people like Fiona Hill in the White House, who understands and knows Russia pretty well. So and we also saw, you know, statements at Munich Security Conference with the Vice President Pence and Secretary of Defense, you know, basically ensuring the allies of America's enduring commitment to NATO. But, you know, still the decider in all of that is Donald Trump. And it's Donald Trump who suddenly at 3 o'clock in the morning can tweet, you know, NATO is obsolete, and I have just made a fantastic deal with this fantastic man Vladimir Putin, and he tends to do these crazy things, and he does have a considerable power. I agree that Trump's powers are moderated by checks and balances system. Thank God for that. They are moderated by the existence of, you know, fairly hawkish Congress, and also by the tradition of American administration. However, the man himself is unpredictable.
The man is unpredictable, and again, that brings us back to the topic at hand, which is how does Europe respond to all of it? John Paulo Accardo, we were looking as we were preparing the show at footage of 60 years ago when the Treaty of Rome was signed, and we've had this political construct that's grown over the years. Now, here in France, we're in the middle of this strange campaign where the fault lines aren't so much about Donald Trump, but about Vladimir Putin. It's even dividing the main center-right party, Les Républicains.
Yes, sure. François Fillon has said that he doesn't see much problems with Vladimir Putin, and he's considered as quite close to Russia compared to the other candidates, the former candidates within Les Républicains, and also compared to the other candidates to the presidential election, maybe with the exception of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is also quite a supporter of Vladimir Putin's Russia. But the other candidates are quite skeptical towards Moscow's attitude. But it must be said that the foreign policy is really not the main point, the main issue in the current presidential election in France. The campaign is going around, mostly around François Fillon's alleged troubles with justice because of his wife alleged fake jobs, and
all right, but when you see those,
the campaign revolves around that.
That's true, but let me just ask you, Gianpaolo, when you see
yes?
that how this has changed the political fault lines in France, what do you extrapolate that? What does it mean for Europe?
You mean Russia?
Yes.
Well, it is something that could, it's like the United States. Russia could bring Europeans together, being more focused on their own issues and being more, let's say, being more cohesive and more and show some more solidarity in foreign policy, because nowadays they are not really united in that. But it also can be very divisive. And towards Russia, currently Europeans are more divided. You can see a fracture between Eastern European countries and Central and Western European countries. They really don't have the same policy. And some are more keen on discussing with Russia, others are more in a position of fear and of possible confrontation. And this is also one of the reasons why there's no real
consensus,
European united and unique consensus and sole policy.
Gianpaolo Accardo, I want to thank you for joining us from Brussels. I want to thank Peter Kleppe as well for being with us from the Belgian capital. Jörg Vorbrig in Berlin and Marcin Zaborowski in Warsaw. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.